Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Nearly 1 in 6 California adults has a mental health need, and approximately 1 out of 20 suffers from a serious mental health challenge that makes it difficult to carry on life's major activities. The rate is even higher among children, where 1 out of 13 suffers from mental health limitations that impact their ability to participate in life activities. Not surprisingly, a lot of families are trying to cope with these problems as they struggle with mental health challenges among their loved ones. And one of them is our guest, Daniel Jamison. He's a local retired attorney. Was here to share his personal experience and his observations of the mental health system. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you for having me on this important program.
You know, you and I have talked about your brother. He's had some mental health challenges. Can you tell us about your family situation, how maybe it's changed over the years?
My deceased older brother was, as a youth, a leader and a great guy. He graduated from high school and was admitted at Stanford. But at age 22, he had a classic onset of severe, disabling, young adult schizophrenia. He went AWOL from the National Guard, and we found him in Palm Springs after his car had broken down, and he'd walked 10 miles in the desert into Palm Springs. With my mother and father, I was a junior in high school. We went on a single-engine chartered aircraft down to Palm Springs to get him. And on the way back, he wanted to get out over Bakersfield, which I looked at my father, who was holding dearly onto him to keep him from opening the door. When we got to Fresno, his condition was so obvious that he was hospitalized at the psychiatric hospitals that we then had at Kingsview and elsewhere. They don't exist anymore, and for long stays. But eventually he was stabilized, although while he was in the hospital, he would hallucinate that his body was eating his head. And he did get stabilized on medication that he was required to take and was able for many decades to live with my parents. And then when my parents had to move out of the longtime family home, they needed to put Steve in an apartment. And it was there that when he was on his own, he went off his medications, and we had a serious problem with him decompensating rapidly. And he became a danger to himself and to others.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. I mean, that happens oftentimes. They get on medications, they feel better, then they get off medications because they're feeling better. You know, but there are programs out there to deal with this. There are red flag laws, there are police welfare check situations laws. I mean, why didn't they help? Why didn't they work?
I contacted the county and asked what we could do to get him into locked care, which is what he needed. And I was told that we have to provide notice under the law to start this process. And if he doesn't answer the door, we can't do anything. The only thing we can do is if the police happen to catch him outside and where he qualifies under a 5150 to be picked up as a danger to self or others. And schizophrenics are not completely non-compass menace. They can be wily in figuring out how to continue to enjoy the wild freedom that the lack of medication gives them. And my brother was certainly one of those.
So it didn't, the laws that existed at the time just really were not helpful.
It just simply was not adequate. And eventually my brother, late at night, he was in a large apartment complex, wooden apartment complex with multiple tenants. And he was hallucinating that he had to start a fire to kill bugs in his kitchen. He'd made a mess of the apartment. There were newspapers all over the floor. He ran around the apartment. They were getting on fire. The apartment filled up with smoke. So did the adjoining apartment. Somebody called the fire department. He refused to let the fire department in. They called the police. They had to break down the door. And then he fought with the police and resisted arrest. And meantime, was there but for the grace that someone was not seriously injured by his behavior. But he was clearly a case where he needed help that could not be provided, and the public needed to be protected from his condition.
That's really interesting. The governor's made a proposal called the Care Courts. We're going to look at in a moment the pros and cons of the governor's proposal. Can it address situations like this in the future? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. The state has been investing heavily in overhauling the state's mental health system for some time. One of the most recent initiatives is something called the Community Assistance Recovery and Empowerment Courts, or the CARE Courts. Proponents call it a major transformation in the state's approach to treatment, a way to divert those struggling with severe mental health or substance abuse issues from incarceration and homelessness. Is it really that good? Our guest is Michelle Cabrera. She's the executive director of the County Behavioral Health Directors Association of California. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you so much for having me.
So people are saying that the governor's initiative, this CARE Courts, represents a pretty significant change in the state's approach to this problem. How will the CARE Courts actually work?
CARE Court is different from what exists today in several ways. First, it focuses the court's interventions, and we're talking about a civil court process here, not criminal court. But it focuses on a narrow set of mental health diagnoses. It opens up the county behavioral health safety net to the entire community, regardless of insurance type. And so that includes people with private insurance would have new kinds of access to the county behavioral health safety net. And it uses the power of the courts to compel individuals to accept treatment, as well as to compel the county safety net to provide treatment. And it does this by imbuing the courts with new powers to sanction and even hold the public safety net in receivership if it does not comply with the court's orders and requests.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the issues, is that word compel, right? Critics of the CARE Courts say that, people who go into care, they're much more successful if they go into voluntary treatment as opposed to, mandatory treatment. Are they right? Do they have a point here?
The debate around forced treatment has been around for a long time within, the treatment of mental illness and substance use disorders. And it certainly was put front and center with the CARE Court debate. Remember that CARE Court narrowly targets individuals with psychosis, including those with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorders. We anticipate that most people will be brought into CARE Court, meaning that someone else will petition the court to ask that they receive services rather than the individual requesting services on their own behalf. Because this process brings them in, and as well as the county safety net before the court, it does raise questions about whether services will be treated as entirely voluntary and whether the array of services that will be required as a result of this process are voluntary. What we know from research is that in the long run, voluntary treatment services are much more effective, and perceived coercion can be detrimental to what we call therapeutic alliance. And that's really your trust in and satisfaction with the services that individuals are receiving. So if they, feel more satisfied with the kinds of services that they're getting, they have that stronger sense of confidence with their providers, they're more likely to retain the gains over the long run.
There's the other criticism is that, we're pushing all these people into the system, but are there the necessary health and housing resources to make these CARE Courts actually work? I mean, are there enough psychiatric facilities and staff available?
Yeah, well, I think that there are two components here, right? The first one is housing. And on housing, I think it's important to say that the Newsom administration has invested more in expanding the state's investments in housing than any prior administration in recent memory. The county behavioral health safety net was heartened by the passage of the most recent budget of 1.5 billion in bridge housing funding for individuals with significant behavioral health needs. About $1 billion of this one-time funding is for transitional or bridge housing that is intended to prioritize care court participants. That said, in the case of bridge and the other housing investments, for the most part, these are one-time rather than ongoing housing investments. And care court itself does not actually produce new housing options beyond what's already available in the community. So think about it this way: a court can prescribe either housing or treatment, but if it doesn't exist in the community, or if it's not accessible to our clients, then it will be a prescription that we can't fill. And as of now, there's no real straightforward answer for that. On the sort of service delivery side, certainly there are significant gaps in what exists for acute behavioral health treatment throughout the state of California. And again, we have seen one-time investments in infrastructure, but a real significant need for ongoing investment in both the workforce as well as treatment options.
Yeah, we're going to see if this ends up turning into an unfunded mandate that counties complain so much about. Well, up next, we're going to talk about homelessness. That's one of the big issues intertwined with mental health challenges. Will care courts actually help solve that problem? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. An estimated 20 to 25% of the U.S. homeless population suffers from severe mental illness, compared to 6% of the general public. The combination of mental illness, substance abuse, and poor physical health makes it difficult to maintain employment and residential stability. As a result, it would appear that better mental health services could combat not only mental illness, but homelessness as well. We're talking with Michelle Cabrera. She's the executive director of the County Behavioral Health Directors Association of California. Michelle, it's my understanding that last year your organization conducted a survey regarding the number of people experiencing homelessness who sought mental health services. What did you find?
Well, what we found is that county behavioral health agencies were fairly effective at encouraging and succeeding in bringing individuals with serious mental illness into treatment on a voluntary basis. Counties throughout the state of California reported that they brought 15,000 individuals into voluntary treatment. However, we could only house roughly 7,000 of them. We were not able to house the remaining 8,000 due to either a lack of housing or other housing barriers.
So I'm wondering, one of the questions here is, in terms of the care courts, they're allowing judges to order other governmental agencies to prioritize care court participants for housing. Do you think that's a workable solution?
Well, I'm curious to see if this will work. Many of the housing barriers that our folks encounter are structural. For example, federal HUD rules often prevent our clients from getting prioritized for housing, particularly if they're coming out of mental health treatment or incarceration. Nothing in care court will allow judges or local housing providers to override federal law. Other common barriers include things like credit or background checks. So it will be part of the experiment of care court to see how that plays out.
There are also, I guess, annual reports are required under this care court proposal. But I'm wondering, how are they going to define success? And what are you going to be looking for?
For our part, we're curious about several elements of the civil court process that is care court. First, we want to know how many petitioners are there and where will these petitions be coming from? For example, will we be seeing cities seeking to address the homelessness crisis, families with privately insured individuals who can't get access through their private insurance or on the open market, or all of the above? We also want to understand how this may change outcomes for our clients. Typically, it can take about 40 or more touches or interactions to voluntarily engage someone into services. This will really truncate that process. So it's not clear if respondents will be responsive or receptive to this approach. And then finally, how will this change our relationship with courts, if at all?
Yeah, those are all pretty important questions. I'm wondering, so if you were designing the system, and what kinds of things would you like to see so these care courts could work more effectively, efficiently, and fairly, frankly?
Yeah, I mean, as I've mentioned, the timelines for engaging our clients are extremely tight. So, given the current workforce crisis, we think it's going to be really, really challenging to meet what the court expects there. A huge component is also this concept of accountability for both individuals with serious mental illness and the safety net that serves them. It gives judges the power to sanction counties for failing to meet their standards. And this really runs counter to the
And I think
collaborative.
I'm sorry, but isn't it like $1,000 a day or something that it can assess counties?
Correct.
Yeah.
And courts could even hold counties in receivership, which means they could take over their entire system if they're unhappy. And this really runs counter to the collaborative nature of our existing relationship in specialty courts. We do, mental health court, homeless court, drug courts today, but those are mostly criminal courts where we're on the same page and partners about trying to help people. I'm worried about how this dynamic could upset that partnership and especially would like to see that sanctions piece removed altogether. Finally, housing and homelessness. If this ends up being the primary focus, I'd like to see the law amended to actually guarantee long term, sustainable, stable housing options and to hold those private plans accountable for their part in failing to meet the needs of individuals with serious
I
mental
think you
illness.
just gave the legislature a to-do list. I want
Yeah.
to I want to thank our guest, Michelle Cabrera, the executive director of the County Behavioral Health Directors Association of California. Up next, one of the most influential voices on mental health reforms, both as the former leader of the California Senate and now current mayor of Sacramento, Darrell Steinberg. His thoughts on the California court proposal and whether or not it's going to help address the state's mental health challenges. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Local officials across California are facing mounting pressure to show progress curbing homelessness, a pervasive problem that polls indicate is really a top concern among residents. Our next guest is Darrell Steinberg. He was first elected mayor of Sacramento in 2016. He's been dealing with the issue of homelessness for some time. He's also championed mental health initiatives. He was leader in the California Senate from 2008 to 2014. And he was a driving force behind Prop 63, the Mental Health Services Act, passed by the voters in 2004. The goal of Prop 63 was to fund mental health services with a 1% income tax on personal income of folks making over $1 million a year. It generates anywhere between $2 to $4 billion a year for such programs. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
It's great to be with you. It's been too many years, Mark, but it's really nice to be back.
It has. It's been reported that in Sacramento County, 34% of the unhoused residents surveyed reported having psychological problems or issues. You've been a decades-long advocate for mental health initiatives. You've called the Care Court proposal groundbreaking. Why?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that homelessness has many causes, and there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And increasingly in this fragile society, there are a lot of people who just plain aren't making it economically. High housing costs, COVID was obviously a major disruption, people not getting enough hours in their work. And so a lot of people are becoming homeless, unsheltered, in part because they can't afford to live. And that requires a different set of solutions, including significant investments in prevention and early intervention to keep people who are fragile and housed instead of unsheltered. For the people who are chronically homeless, who have been out there a long time, the vast majority of them undoubtedly have significant underlying issues, mental health and often substance abuse issues, in addition to a variety of physical health maladies that are disabling. And so I believe Care Court, the Governor Newsom's Care Court, is a very far-reaching and potentially game-changing proposal if it is implemented in the right way.
That's what I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
Some people are concerned about the funding. Is there enough money here to actually make this thing work? Could they use Prop 63 funding to help support the care courts?
They could use Prop 63 funding for the services portion. But I'm sorry, it took a while to get to actually answer your question. Here's the reason why I think it has such great potential. Because for the first time, it states in law, at least for the 6,000 or 7,000 people who will benefit when somebody files a court petition, that the counties in this instance have a legal obligation to actually provide the services and the care to people. And that people have a responsibility then to avail themselves and to accept the services. The fact that their proposal, at least in a beginning way, links rights and a right to mental health care with an obligation to accept it, I think is a window into what would be even bigger if it were done in an even broader way. So I think it's a really important start.
So there might be some Prop 63 money for non-capital projects to implement the care courts. What about Medicaid? I mean, that's been around. Doesn't that already provide a safety net for the homeless, people with mental health issues?
There are two significant sources of community mental health funding now in California. One is Prop 63, the Mental Health Services Act. It's about $4 billion a year. The other is, in fact, Medicaid. The existing Medicaid funding is in the billions, but now there's a new opportunity. Again, the governor and the legislature have brought forward this idea of CalAIM, and we've successfully obtained a waiver from the federal government to be able to use federal Medicaid dollars and the state and county match to actually provide more than healthcare to people, to provide housing, to provide employment supports, to provide the case management and the encampment engagement that is so necessary in order to help get people out of these situations in the first place. So that is a new and important source of funding. You know, we always need more money.
Right.
But in my view, Mark, money is not our fundamental problem today. The real challenge is systems reform. How are we going to get cities and counties to work together better? How are we going to make the health plans actually serve the population that is most vulnerable and most in need? And that's why I believe that ultimately we need to move to some form of a legal right to care, a legal right to housing, and then a legal obligation for people to accept it. Because when the law requires us to coordinate, to work better, to meet timetables, to meet production numbers, I think there's a much better chance that we're going to get there.
And that actually, and I'm sorry for interrupting, but that actually has been something that people have talked about. You've really put your finger on something important. I want to thank Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg for being with us today. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thank you for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.